It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Welcome to this neighborhood, neighbor.
Oh boy, I couldn't resist. And I'm just sad that I don't have a pink cardigan like that to wear today for all of you. But so it's the second, or we call it often sort of the second greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself, as Jesus said. And yet in some ways he said this commandment is like it. It's almost equal in some ways. Or we might say not equal to, but at least inseparable from the command to love God. And yet we often, I don't think, give quite as much, we don't give as much thought as we should. What does that actually mean, to be a neighbor? And that's how Jesus phrased it too, right? When a man comes and challenges Jesus and says, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the conclusion of the story of the Good Samaritan is this. The question is not, who is my neighbor? The question is, how will I be a neighbor? How will I live a life that is a life of being a neighbor to someone else? And so today, I want to explore that and just take this week to just talk about some practical aspects of what it means for us to be neighbors. And I want to read from a text that at first might not seem like it really fits well, but I really like it partly because it's a great text to read as we're entering and almost to this Advent season. It's from the first chapter of the book of Luke. And I hope you'll just notice as we read through this the influence and the presence of this group of people called the neighbors and relatives. And so this is the story of the birth of John the Baptist. And I want you to listen to these words from the book that we love. Luke chapter 1, verses 57 to 66. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. And if you remember, Zechariah could not speak at this time. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened, and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is the story of John the Baptist's birth. And of course, John the Baptist being the one who would come and the great prophet who would prepare the way for the Lord, prepare the way for Jesus, God's Messiah. And as this unfolds, there's a lot of miraculous and incredible things. Angels coming to deliver messages, miraculous conceptions and birth, and and Zechariah not being able to speak, and then miraculously being able to speak again. And yet, underlying all of this is kind of this very, what I would call mundane, this normal, everyday life of the neighbors and relatives gathering around, of the naming of a child, in this case of taking the child as was the normal custom to be circumcised. And so in the midst of all this, what we look at and see as this incredible, miraculous story, those are the blips that kind of push the story along, and yet in between all of that is the everyday life that's unfolding and happening, just as it kind of always has. And so that's important to remember. And so as I want to walk through this passage again, and so you can listen to specific things that I want you to see. But as you hear the terms relatives and neighbors or just neighbors, I want you to remember a few things, and to remember, number one, that they lived at this time in a much more communal culture than what we have now. So people are engaged in each other's lives. They're all up in each other's business, right? And in ways that we can't even imagine now. Even with social media and, everything kind of being out there, this was even much more that way, right? Everybody knew who everybody else was in a small agrarian communities like this. So they lived, but more importantly than they just knew each other's junk, it was more important even that they shared life together, and they shared those resources that made life possible. They depended on one another. They were interdependent. There would have been a crowd, for instance, as Elizabeth gave birth, which might sound kind of awful to some of you women who have given birth. And yet that's the way it was. Birth is an exciting but also dangerous event, and the women of the village would have come around and been with her, and they would have been there when they went to name the child. There are relatives present, so there's this communal thing. And so as we walk through today, practical ways that you can think about loving your neighbor, I want you to think of your community. And you can try to just think of one specific place, because in our lives we tend to be fairly fractured in our sort of modern American existence. And there's not a ton we can do about that. There are a few things, but I want you to mostly just think of one of those communities. Is it going to be the people at work that you interact with? Maybe it is the people right next door to you. Maybe it's this tight-knit group of friends that you have. Maybe it's the people or classmates that you have at school. Maybe it's our neighborhood here in Holland Heights that we are continually trying to work and try to join God in God's work here in Holland Heights. So I want you to pick one of those communities in your mind as we walk through this today and think about that. But I also just think, when I think of community, I think of this wonderful community that we have here, and that Heights of Hope particularly has fostered in the Holland Heights neighborhood, and particularly in the Soar neighborhood. And I think of the meal that they shared on Thanksgiving, to just gather in the new community center, which we're just in such great celebration about. And if you haven't gotten to check it out, ask somebody at Heights of Hope when you could go and visit and see it. And I'm sure there'll be events coming up there in the coming year that you'll get to participate and see it. And they shared Thanksgiving meal there this past Thursday with just a group of people, just sharing food, sharing life together. And what a beautiful picture of community that is. But let's walk through this passage. Starting in verse 57. What did the neighbors do? I want you to look at the passage. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. So the neighbors hear, and neighbors share. In other words, neighbors show up. They're present. That might seem really obvious, and yet it's not always in our world. We're not always present there. We can easily hide in our homes, whatever they may be. We can easily just kind of lock ourselves in and isolate ourselves. And so it's important to remember that here in this story, we see how these neighbors play a critical role as John the Baptist is born by simply hearing what the Lord had done, right? They're listening, they're expecting, they're anticipating, and they show up and share life together. Now, the next verse, 59, I know that's smaller print. I'll read it though. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah, but his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There's no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was open and his tongue was set free, and he began to speak, praising God. Now, this one's not quite as obvious as that other one, since we had two nice, clear verbs on that other one. But I see the neighbors still being present, and as they are present, they participate. They help guide, right? They're there to help literally with kind of the birth, and then they're there to help with the naming process. And they help to be kind of go-betweens in some ways to say and to help validate, is this really the name that you mean? Why are you naming it that? And like, let's talk to Elizabeth. Let's talk to John. Let's be there. Let's participate in this act so that their joy and their process of giving meaning and a name to this young child is not just a solitary act that they share alone. It's one that the neighbors and relatives get to share with them through their act of kind of guiding and validating and just being present in that way. Then, all the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him. So what do neighbors do? Neighbors go, "Wow." Like, whoa. And I think that's important to remember it that way, because if you think back, what was the phrasing there? It was we're talking about what are the verbs? What do the neighbors do? Well, this one's a passive one. They were filled with awe. And there's this point when us, as neighbors, as people who are trying to love our neighbor, who have been commanded to do that, where we have to just stand back and receive. Where we have to stand back and say, "God, you are present here." And that awe comes from not just seeing something amazing. That awe comes from an expectation. Are we expecting God to show up? Or is this just the humdrum of life? Right? This is one of the keys to being a neighbor. Can you look past the ordinary and see the extraordinary? To be filled with awe. Because modern life, beware, it will suck you in. It will suck us into thinking that we're just going to go on autopilot. We do the things we always do. We go to work, we check our email, we go on social media, then we go on Netflix, then we go to bed, then we wake up, then we go to practice, then we do this other thing, then we do our sports. And we need to be shaken out of it. And part of that comes when God just kind of forces us to wake up and see what's right in front of us. But some of that comes from the discipline and habits that we develop in our own lives of noticing and being present, of just simply saying, "God, I expect you to show up here. I don't know how, I don't know where, but I know you're a God who's at work. And that you're at work not just in the huge and extraordinary, you're at work in my everyday, and in my neighbors, in my friends, in my coworkers, in my classmates." So around the water cooler, with neighbors chatting on the back porch, God shows up. God shows up in the meal that is shared in the nursing home when people gather together. God shows up during those long nights awake with crying babies, and when you show up and you talk to your neighbors who are hurting or rejoicing. And so the call here is to let yourself go, "Wow," and to not miss those opportunities. And then what the neighbors did is they went and told everybody about it. And so this is the beautiful part of getting to be a witness to what God is doing, is that we say, "God did this incredible thing, and let me encourage someone else with that story. Let me tell the stories and not hold in what God has been doing in my life or in the life of my community. Let's tell the good things that are happening here at Calvary, in your workplace, in our neighborhood, in our region, in our world. Let's be bearers and witnesses to what God is doing." That word to testify, when we say we've got to give a testimony, that's the word, the language of being a witness, right? Witnesses in a courtroom give testimony to what they've seen. That's what we do when we share the stories of, "This is what God is doing in my life." That's what we did here when we stood up on Thanksgiving Eve service and people shared, "This is what I'm thankful for. This is how I see God working in my life." And it's a beautiful thing. So what are some of the practical ways then that we can kind of be a neighbor? Well, the first just starts with some very simple things. I know in my own life, right now, when I think of my sort of literal neighbors, those people who live in the houses around our house, there's just been some simple things recently that we've gotten to do, which is just simply to show up and to talk. And if you can't see the picture, it's kind of dark. There's a bunny and my daughter, Eliana, there. So one of the best connections we've made is simply to care for our neighbors across the street, care for their bunnies when they're away. And we love doing that because we don't want pets ourselves. So it works out perfectly that we can just occasionally get our bunny time in and then give them back. But it's a beautiful thing because those small things that we do as neighbors and as coworkers, as friends, they seem small, and yet it's so easy to just say no, right? Something gets in the way. In fact, we just recently said no to this because we were feeling sick and overwhelmed with just life in general. And yet, those opportunities have led us to connect with those beautiful neighbors that we have. It helps us to recognize that, oh, you're going out of town. What's going on? Oh, well, my grandmother just died. Oh, well, we're going to go visit my mom or my dad who is sick or having surgery. And all of a sudden, this door is opened up through this very simple act of just being a neighbor for each other. Or just the other day when some excitement happened in our neighborhood when I came home and there were tire tracks across just a very small part of our lawn and then across a bunch of my neighbor's lawn, and then realizing there was a car sitting there and a police car, and the tree, something wasn't right with the whole picture because there was a tree that had been sitting there in my neighbor's yard that just wasn't there anymore. And luckily everybody was okay, but somebody had just gone right off the road. So I went out there and we talked and we connected, and it's just another form of connection, just to be a neighbor and to be present and to say, is there something I can do? What's going on? How can we help? Neighbors just sitting and talking. So the first thing that I want to invite you to do as a practical step, and we did this, and I did this as I led us through a small group that we did this past spring, just Love Your Neighbor training. And there were four things that we walked through, one thing each week. And I want to walk you through those things as well, just very quickly today. We're not going to obviously go into depth with all of them. But the first is simply to notice, right? The neighbors in this story, they're good neighbors because they just show up and they notice, they hear, right? They hear and they show up. They share life together. And part of noticing means that as you're thinking about this place where your neighbors are that you're going to try to love better in the coming weeks and months, what's the story there? What's the history? Every place and every people, every group has a certain culture, has a certain feeling. They have a certain story to it or a certain history. The neighborhood that my wife and I felt most kind of ingrained with and certainly had the most kind of quirks to it was the neighborhood we lived in Ohio. And I've shared a few stories about that neighborhood before. It was a very interesting mix of an old historic neighborhood, but that was very run down and had just a whole diversity of people and incomes and races in it. So a really interesting and odd mix of folks, but a beautiful and wonderful neighborhood that we loved living in. And part of that neighborhood, as we got to meet some of our neighbors, especially the group of neighbors that we called the historic neighbors, not because they were really old or something, but because they were the ones who were really interested in renovating some of the historic homes there, and that's why they lived in that neighborhood. And so they kind of had a group, you could say a small group, so to speak. And they would meet together a lot. And we found out that in 2002, on July 27th, there was this woman, Sherry Corbett. Sherry had been the heart and the soul of this neighborhood. She had been the driving force, full of energy, full of vision, a real kind of like, if she decides she's going to do something, she would just go for it and kind of just run people over with it and pull people along with her and say, let's make this happen. Let's renovate this house. Let's do this neighborhood event. Let's do this thing. And everybody then, of course, followed Sherry as kind of the soul and top leader of this neighborhood. But on July 27th, 2002, one of the people that Sherry had worked a great deal with in the neighborhood and who Sherry was actually a landlord for, just out of nowhere, murdered her. Sherry was murdered right in the neighborhood, suddenly taken from her neighbors. And this, of course, shook the neighborhood so much. But and that's an important story to know, right? You've got to know that when you come in. You've got to learn those things. You've got to ask questions. And it doesn't just matter just because, I want to know the gossip. It matters because for us, we had always wondered about this man, Bob. Bob had what I considered in this neighborhood the most beautiful historic home in the neighborhood. He kept it up so well, and he had such a passion for it. But Bob, we'd see Bob all the time. We'd try to wave to him as we walked by his house, but I never really got to meet him. He was always out working on his home, working on other people's stuff, and caring for his properties. But he didn't want to talk. He didn't show up to any of the parties. He just seemed like he was hard to get to know, maybe kind of an ornery old man, honestly. Well, come to find out, he's got a story. He and Sherry were business partners for years and years, and deep, deep friends. And if we don't understand how that all played out in the story of that place, we would never understand Bob. We would never understand or be able to sympathize with why he was the way he was, why he felt like he always had a chip on his shoulder or was closed off to the world. It's because he was broken from that experience. And so you got to know the stories. And the stories not only are the individual personal stories that happen, they're also the larger forces that are at work. You've got to ask the question, what shapes this place or this group of people? Why are they the way they are? In other words, who lives here or who works here or who participates in this and why? And maybe more importantly, who isn't here? Who isn't participating and why? Because that's when you start to get down to the nitty-gritty. Who has felt or been actively excluded? Or who does not feel like they can connect? Or who cannot afford to live here, for instance, and why? Or why was this neighborhood created the way it was? And that helps us to ask some good and hard, pressing questions that we need to ask as we try to be good neighbors. We have to notice things. Notice simple things like, is that house changing? Why are houses going up for sale so quickly or so slowly? Or why does this one neighbor do this one thing that bothers me? Are we going to notice those things, those little changes and those little things that shape a neighborhood or a place or a people? And the next thing is to embrace, right? Just to simply try to pour out and think of ways. Once you notice things, you can then start to ask yourself, how then can I love this place well? To love these people well. And that means taking some risks, making some mistakes. And when I say go out and make some mistakes, I don't mean actually try to make mistakes. It just means that we need to be a little more bold. We need to go and try to be helpful to that neighbor, even though we think, well, maybe they don't want us to kind of get into their stuff, or maybe they don't want me to ask those questions, or we're not going to know unless we try. And particularly that comes when we're trying to lean into difference, which as Christians we are, of course, called to, and particularly here at Calvary, we have heard the call from God to try to be people that bridge the dividing walls that God has destroyed across race and economics and cultures and geography. And we're trying to find, how do we do that well? And how do we break down the walls that are inside of us that are keeping us from building those relationships in the first place? And so we, in these places, as we notice things, we need to be noticing, who are those people that I might be intentionally avoiding, that I cut the conversation short with, or who I don't think I have anything in common with. And that might be actually a clue, not that God is pushing you or closing that door, but that God is actually asking you to walk into that relationship. And that's going to take some work. Now, there are times, of course, to get into that huddle with those people who are our safe places and safe people. And so that's not to say we are always constantly putting ourselves or our families, and particularly for people who have been have been on the underside of discrimination, who have been marginalized. They need those safe spaces and people to rejuvenate and encourage them. But for a lot of us, We need to keep leaning into our differences, to people who are different than us. We need to get out of our comfort zone, as the cliche goes. One of the things, though, is just be willing to show up in places and with people that we might not otherwise do that, because God opens doors. One story, which is kind of along these lines, is in this neighborhood we lived in Ohio, the Dayton Lane Historic District. They had a lot of different kinds of parties that they call sachets, and they'd go from house to house, and there would be a lot of appetizers and often a lot of too many libations shared, which was not of our liking, but we loved these people and we're trying to get to know them. And there was one party in particular that they had a sachet. They went house to house, and it was near Halloween time, and it was a costume party, and they decided to have a theme because they like to have themes for their costume parties, and they called it a Sinners and Saints costume party. So people could kind of interpret that however they wanted. It made for some interesting costumes, sinners and saints. But the one thing that was most interesting to Krista and I was that as people came over to our house, which was one of the homes that people stopped at, we noticed that there were a lot of people. Well, I should say too, first, you were supposed to dress as what you considered the opposite of yourself, right? So if you consider yourself sort of a goody-goody and you're a saint, right, you're supposed to dress up as something that you consider a sinner, right? These people were not generally Christians, so the language kind of changes, right? So you got to put your mindset on that. And then sinners. So if you consider yourself, I'm a bad boy, I'm going to dress up as a saint then for the costume party. So there were a lot of people who showed up wearing clerical collars to my house and who didn't know us, who just were following the path of everyone else. So they dressed up as pastors and to be the opposite of themselves, and then came in. So we actually had several conversations that Krista and I still laugh about, where we're sitting, or sitting around the appetizers and eating and just making small talk, and then somebody with a clerical collar would come up to me and say, "Oh, so what do you do for a living?" "Well, I'm a pastor," and it would get real awkward after that. But it was a great experience in just remembering and learning how to just be around people who are different, right? People who have a different view of life. And then, of course, the next step is always, and of course, maybe it's not the next step, it's really the first step, the second, third, fourth, fifth. It's the always step as we go through the process of trying to love other people, is we have to be prayerful people. We've got to pray for them. Now, we can never just stop at prayer, because so many times when we're praying, "God, will you please help my neighbor?" We're often the answers to our own prayer, right? So we need to be careful that it's not just about prayer, and yet it's always about prayer. We can't do it without prayer. We can't see because noticing and embracing is about seeing with God's eyes. And the way that we see with God's eyes best is through prayer, by going to God in prayer and asking, "God, will you open up my eyes and help me to see the world the way you see the world?" And so this could mean one of the best ways to do this is to prayer walk through a neighborhood. Just as you pass by a house, maybe you know the story of somebody there and you want to pray for them. Maybe you don't, and you just want to say a blessing over your neighborhood. Maybe you want to pray for God to move and to, "God, we've been trying to work on this park for a long time," or, "God, we've been really needing this in our neighborhood. God, will you bring this to happen?" So it can be general prayers, specific prayers for certain people, but just to walk through and to have a literal physical thing. That's why prayer walking is so powerful, right? Well, you can also do that just through a mental map, to just write down, here are the places and the people in my space that I want to pray for. I know, one of the best and simplest examples of this is many of the teachers that I know of who have tried to live out their Christian faith and to pray for their classroom, to pray for their students. They'll literally show up in the morning, and if they have time, they will sit in different seats and pray for different students, or they'll walk through their classroom and pray over the day's lessons, or pray for over the classroom. And so it's that kind of a thing, right? You don't always have to be there, but you can take in your mind and walk through those people and places. The other thing And what this helps us do is this can also start combining with noticing and embracing. And for me, one of the ways that I did this was in my neighborhood in Ohio, the BHF. I called him the BHF. He's my Basset Hound friend. When we moved to Ohio, for that first year especially, we were very lonely. And so my best friend was this Basset Hound that I would walk by on my walks. And I started timing and doing my runs so that my cool-down walk would always be past this house. And he was always just sitting there, and I love Basset Hounds. They're so cute, with floppy ears and the droopy face. So I'd always walk by, and I'd talk to it, and the dog would kind of wag its tail, and I just loved it. But then you start noticing things like that, and if you actually take time and slow down in the places where you live or the places where you work and it starts to open up opportunities. And so I was able to have a really great conversation one time with somebody because there was a second Basset Hound to my great delight at this house one day. And the person in the house had never been outside before, but they were this one day. And so I got to ask them, oh, well, there's this new dog here, and that we got to strike up a conversation, and then from then on we got to talk together, and nothing super profound came of that. And yet it was an opportunity and an open door that would not have happened if I had not stopped and slowed down, if I had not noticed what was going on, if I had not started praying for that person in that house each time that I walked by. One of the other things when it comes to prayer is to remember to ask. Now, some of us are not comfortable praying for other people out loud and in front of them, or asking other people, can I pray for you? And my advice to you is, that's a whole sermon for another time, but my challenge to you is get over that. Find a way to get over that. As a Christian person, one of your goals in your lifetime, in your walk of discipleship, should be that at least by the time you draw your last breath, you should be comfortable praying out loud for somebody else who needs prayer from you. Right? That is just a basic discipleship skill, not the skill of a pastor or just of an elder or of a chaplain. That's a skill that every Christian should basically have. I care for you. I'm going to lift up words of prayer and encouragement over you right here and right now. It doesn't mean we're going to go around and do that every day all the time, but that you should be able to have that skill and that courage. And so ask God for that. Ask God to open up opportunities. We were able to do that with one of our neighbors in Ohio when right next door, this wonderful neighbor that we had, Kathy, and we still miss her, and her husband passed away soon after we moved there. We didn't know where she was in faith. It turns out she's an incredibly strong and faithful Christian woman. But we didn't know that at the time. And just to be able to stop and say, can we pray for you right now? And she said, that'd be wonderful. And we said, can we not just do that like in our house? Would it be okay if we pray out loud for you right now? And she said, yes. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? Somebody's going to say, no, thank you. Or no, I don't want that. And honestly, in my experience, a couple of those times when I felt like, ooh, somebody really got really weird about that, it actually opened a door for me to ask about that. Now, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just is awkward, and that's okay. But sometimes they open the door and they say, I don't want that right now. You say, oh, well, is there something to that? Or oh, no, I don't pray. And you can ask a follow-up question. It might open a door to a conversation. And the last thing is, of course, just to connect with somebody. Not just to pray, not just to try to love them, not just to notice things, but to really try to make a deeper connection. And does that mean that each of these relationships, even in the examples, does it mean that they're going to be your best friends? That something incredible, miraculous, or profound is going to happen? No, not always. Those, as I said before, even in the story of Jesus and John's birth, those are kind of the blips that push the story along, but there's all this space in the meantime. There's all those 9 months in between the incredible conception when Elizabeth gets pregnant at an old age, and when Zechariah can't speak anymore. There's 9 months in between there where we're not told what happens. We're not told how God shows up, but we know God is there. The neighbors and the relatives are there at the birth, and incredible things happen. And yet it's in that ordinary, everyday life. And so are those connections always going to be something incredible? No, but that's not the point. The point is just to simply love our neighbor and to be a good neighbor to them. And so to try to find those ways to connect, to try to find those ways that we can be a neighbor to somebody. So what I want to challenge you to do is to give a really practical challenge this time of year. I think oftentimes of, especially in Michigan, I think of winter as the time of year when meeting with my neighbors pretty much stops. Because when I meet with my neighbors who are right around me around my house, we see each other a lot in the summer because we're outside. We don't go outside in the winter except to snowblow our driveways, and then we just kind of wave at each other, yeah, you endure it too, yeah. But winter is actually, this holiday season can be an amazing time to connect with people. There are a lot of people and a lot of special meals that we're sharing. There's a lot of special baking that's going on. There's a lot of special events that you can invite people to. There's a lot of people who are feeling a little lonely. Some of you, maybe. And there's ways that maybe you're feeling lonely, and a way to not only help that loneliness, but to help someone else is maybe invite them over for a holiday meal together. Or to identify someone in your family or at your workplace or in your neighborhood who might just need or want or just to start a friendship. Maybe they don't have a lot of needs. You're not trying to be a savior here, just trying to be a friend and a good neighbor. But to invite someone over just to share a meal, to share some time together this holiday season. I want you to think about that. Is there somebody in your life, in a workplace, at school, at home, that you could connect with in a new way to cross a sort of a bridge that maybe hasn't been crossed before in that relationship? Because after all, that's what the season that we're entering into, that's what it's all about. It's about knowing that we serve and we worship a God who crossed that bridge and continues to cross that bridge to us all the time. That Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be exploited, but made himself nothing and came in the form of a human being and suffered even death on a cross, right? That's the season that we're entering into, this idea that we have a longing for God and that longing is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we long for him to come into our lives, and he does come into our lives when we connect with neighbors and friends in new and profound ways. And so this season, Jesus invited himself over, and Jesus invited others to be with him. Jesus accepted the hospitality of others, and Jesus was hospitable. And so my challenge to you is to be those things. To really love your neighbor in a way, to notice them, to embrace them, to pray for them, and to connect with them in the way that Jesus calls us to do, and in the way that Jesus certainly has for you. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the great gift of your Son, Jesus Christ. God, we recognize that as we look around our life and our community, there are people that we can connect with better. There may be people that we've been avoiding connection with. There may be people who we just haven't put the effort in, God. Or there may be just loads of people that in the busyness of our lives and the distraction of so many other things, we just haven't taken the time to stop and notice and then embrace the people who are right in front of us. God, help us to slow down and to notice. Give us your eyes to see the world as you see it, to see people as you see them, created in your image and loved by you. God, help us then to identify, each one of us in this room, to identify just one or two people that we can connect with in a new way, that we can take a baked good over for, that we can invite over to dinner, that we can accept an invitation that maybe we were thinking of turning down, but that we now see might be a great way to connect with this person or this group of people. God, help us to know how to be good neighbors, not just to be nice, and not just to love them from afar in our hearts, but to really connect and embrace as you have for us, Jesus Christ, and for which we are eternally grateful for your love and sacrifice. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.